Okay, so are we ready? We are starting with the next presentation, which was prepared by Fast Right, duo of two very interesting young Slovenian bloggers, namely Enea Kaučič and Max Valencic. Unfortunately, Enea Kaučič is not present today because of the inconvenience. Max is here. Let me present a quick, let me make a big bio thing. Max, okay. Sorry, I didn't sleep very well. Max Valencic is completing his master's studies in the Department of Communication at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University in Ljubljana. He is the editor of the publication Šum, an incoming researcher at the New Center for Research and Practice, and the co-founder of the blog, namely Fast Right. Enea Kaučič is a master's student of philosophy at the Philosophy Department of the University of Ljubljana. Her undergraduate thesis addressed the topic of AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, and its relation to post-humanist thought through a comparative study of the work of the neo-rationalist philosopher Reza Nagarastani and the accelerationist philosophy of Nick Lang, asking how their work may serve as a counterpoint to humanist conceptions of artificial intelligence. She was also a collaborator in the 16th edition of the publication Šum, titled Xeno-Yugoslavia Covered Chronologies, that was published as a part of the program of this Biennale. She is also an active member of the research group of Matonia, which traverses various philosophical disciplines such as phenomenology, process philosophy, second order, cybernetics, etc. So, as you can guess, this presentation will be more philosophical than the others, and Max will talk about cosmologies.
Or, yeah, now my microphone, and I should project a slide. So let me start. I changed the title of my talk, and now it's called Meta-Cosmologies, and you will see what it's all about in a second. So in recent years, we saw a new interest in cosmologies or cosmological thinking, and within these attempts, we encounter two connected but distinct approaches. One is directly connected to exiting capitalism or capitalist realism, as Mark Fisher described our predicament, and can be coupled with the left accelerationist idea of inventing different futures beyond the horizon that capitalist economics gives us in advance. The other one is potentially even more fundamental, as its main goal is not only exiting capitalism, but exiting modernity in its entirety, and with it abandoning the epistemological imposition from the West. Within this trajectory, we find ontological turn in anthropology, YUFU's conception of cosmotechnics, and much more. Let's stick with the left accelerationist example and try to connect it with the whole invented-discovered debate. Here we are referring to questions like, is mathematics discovered or invented? That will be the basis for our talk. For them and their project of leftist hegemony, the cosmologies are open to new configurations and can be changed and transformed freely because of that. The SET project is in this way mostly political and ideological, and therefore epistemological, and the challenge is to fight a hegemonic battle within the realm of politics and win in the end. Here we can remember Mark Fisher's response in discussion with Jody Dean. I'm here recollecting what Zeno Gotik said in this year's lecture on capitalist realism in Ljubljana, to the famous quote by Ursula Le Guin, quote, "We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, so did the divine right of kings." For Fisher, even in the period of neoliberal ideological deadlock, this was an absolute and unextraordinary fact, as the neoliberal project was primarily a political and not an economic one. The illusion was part of the supposed inability to act or to fundamentally change things within the system itself. Most of the critiques and interest in cosmology from the left operate in this way. Their focus is on the cultural and political landscape, and they try to assert their own version of complex hegemony, to use Alex Williams' term. And this is also how other, potentially even more prominent figures outside of left accelerationism approach this question. There's capitalist modernity with all its structural inequalities and biases, and we have to construct a new framework of reference, a new relation between people and not things that will help us escape from this dreadlock and put forth a more meaningful emancipatory project. Within this milieu, this means a society freed from work, exploitation, gender norms, racism, and all other types of oppression, and most importantly, the ability to set its own norms, goals, desires that will finally be freed from the shackles of the existing system, or will, in relation to the exiting modernity framework, enable different cultures to posit their own self-autonomy, and finally, after a long time of dispossession, enable them to construct their own cosmotechnics and therefore alternative temporalities and locally specific moral and cultural norms, their own relationship to the past, present, and future that springs forth from this new configuration and not from the competitive pressures of capital accumulation and decoding of codes. At this point, we have to ponder on the likeliness of that scenario and potentially even of its human all-to-human nature. It seems to us that this kind of propositions are in a way indifferent to the dialectical materialism's understanding of history following distinct phases of development, or of the updated version of the plane of consistency that Deleuze and Guattari developed in Thousand Plateaus. Without jumping ahead, we can point to a couple of examples that will potentially challenge this somewhat optimistically set framework of inventing new futures and pinpoint the ways in which this conception is still too idealistic and underdeveloped. Let's start with an example by Reza Negarestani in a conversation with Jason Mohagek. In a talk for Future Studies, Negarestani convincingly argued that in order to kill God, monotheism has to be in place. That only through monotheism, the underlying disenchantment of nature can take its course and converge in the Nietzschean death of God and the birth of nihilism, hopefully in the positive and not negative sense. As we will later see with Davor Löffler's materialist conception of cosmologies, we can say that various polytheistic religions weren't able to propagate matter in a way to reach new level of societal integration or development, and in this way, here following Joscha Bach, different religions can be understood as different software implementations within a computational universe we are a part of. And furthermore, that each variant enables different kind of ingression or optimization that can lead to the discovery of new structural regularities or can perpetuate stasis in the cul-de-sac optimization we, for example, find in the cyclical or empty version of time. It's therefore important to already at this point highlight the fully materialist basis of these cosmological notions and how political, economic, cognitive, philosophical, and metaphysical structures emerge from them. Furthermore, similar to the real abstraction of commodity form in Son Rettel's account of ancient Greece, Nick Szabo outlines how collectibles augmented our large brain and language a solution to the prisoner's dilemma that keeps almost all animals from cooperating via delayed reciprocation with non-kin. This was a quote. Another fully materialist and just as brilliant example is given by Olaf Stapledon in Last and First Man. In the novel, the remaining units of humanity are scattered across the galaxy, while one of them runs a simulation of humanity history on Earth. In shock, it realizes that human history doesn't quite follow the same historical pattern of development, or rather enlightenment idea of eternal progress, as it did with our real-time iteration. That, for example, even though capitalist modernity has emerged, there hasn't been no bourgeoisie revolution, and the progressive narrative was subsumed by a more sophisticated version of techno-feudalism. So even within this conception, we see that something strange is going on and that potentially there's a more fundamental underlying material reality that is regulating, or better restricting, the scope of possible action that different cultures or cosmologies can tap into and unlock, and that this is an alternative perspective on the whole question of meta-cosmologies, i.e., was there relation to the realm outside of human subjectivity, let's call it quantum hypergraph, experience and thought? Was this non-dialectical communication that was best described by François Laruelle as unilateral duality, or the determination in the last instance from the real? Before we explore this line of thought in its entirety, let's quickly talk about the Afterword to Alien Capital book by Primož Krašovec. In it, Vincent Lee talks about meta-capitalism, where different historical capitalisms are understood as specific implementations of this universal capitalist history that doesn't know any external limit apart from the internal ones that it regularly crosses. Through the capitalist axiomatics, we can in a similar vein question the supposed necessity of the left-right distinction and how this political axis is far from fundamental but fully embedded within, or alternatively, a product of bourgeoisie revolution and therefore part of the same underlying trap, and needs a proper diagonalization or exiting from this frame of reference. Since the real innovation of capitalism is the before-mentioned universal history or general axiomatics with internal and no external limit and internal and not external contradiction, we can see how different political systems function as different implementations of capital or reaction to it within this universal capitalist history. With the help of this framing, we can be truly heretical and equalize all ideologies under the same space of possible action and potentially even question the hard distinctions between them, or the supposed purity of revolutionary thought and action. As Vincent Lee reminds us, quote, "In the same way, the socialist states of the 20th century were neo-archaic reactions to capitalism in favor of a more despotic pre-capitalist regimes," end quote. In this regard, we see how capitalism and communism in the 20th century were different implementations of industrial capitalism and how they both, notwithstanding their ideological differences, functioned within the same paradigm and set of constraints. What does it then mean for capitalism to be meta-capitalism, if we again borrow Vincent Lee's expression? Meta-capitalism, in a way, relativizes different ideologies, or in this way, cosmologies, and shows their actual essence. The fact that cosmologies are best understood as different software implementation within the computational universe we inhabit. And secondly, that there can be no objective criteria for embracing this or that cosmology, since all of them have a stake in the game within the said universe. Moreover, this goes to show that different historical implementations track different computational invariances, i.e. structural regularities or conditions of possible action, and ingress the landscape and test their applicability from the only arbiter in question, from the determination of the real in the last instance. All cosmologies are then embroiled in reality testing, even if for different reasons this fact is never revealed as such, and this is the cold truth of them. As we will see, and as Davor Löffler has brilliantly deciphered this deep futurology in question, it's all about ingressing reality and revealing platonic processual forms that enable an entity to expand its space of possible action and therefore externalize agency and recursively integrate itself ever more thoroughly into the environment, into the universe from which it extracts energy and dissipates entropy. Here we see, albeit only momentarily, a possibility for a different conception of what is going on. With this in mind, we can see why inventing is potentially a problematic or misleading word, since it gives us the wrong impression that the future is radically less determined than the past. Abstract horror is thus horror on the level of the process itself, and this is the essence of the non-standard or unconditional accelerationism. Deleuze and Guattari have something similar in mind when they say that capitalism has haunted all previous social formations, even if it has come at the end. We are embedded in an abstract diagram on a plane or a coordinate system where all things, i.e. software implementations and their parts, exist simultaneously, and this is the key observation of accelerationism. To give you a direct quote from 1,000 Plateaus, all history does is to translate a coexistence of becomings into a succession. Even if capitalism as a social formation came at the end, it was already anticipated by two previous social formations or machines, the primitive and despotic regime. In a way, it haunted all of the previous formations, their codes, even if it emerged at the end. That's why within this framework, given in Anti-Oedipus, capitalism outlines the possibility of universal history since it signifies its own completion, its own retro-causality. But this is definitely not the end of the story, even if it already contains all of the elements of a time travel movie. The thing is that Marx's communism is different than the variants we encounter in the wild. It has a special component, a formal and rational one, and it tries to develop a critique of capitalism through it without ever thinking about the particularities or the specifics of the human nature. No, Marx's critique of capitalism is objective, as it delineates the advent of transcendental forms, the way commodity form is established, the way surplus value becomes a reality, and so forth. Succinctly put, it described what capitalism as a socio-economic system can encompass within itself, what kind of incentives it establishes, and what it's structurally blind to. Marx's wager is, looking from the point of view of the 21st century, the following. Communism is also just a potentially better implementation of intelligence accumulation through a more radical human emancipation, without the artificial barriers that capitalism, although they can certainly be productive, imposes. That's why China, for example, and to isolate only this event, is closer to communism simply because it's not afraid to kill capital. In sectors where capital accumulation negatively affects the participants and their environment. And it's interesting to see how in this move we also encounter a slight change in the understanding of what capital actually is. More on that later. Louis Althusser is therefore right that Marx is the first one who takes history as a scientific object of investigation, and that at the same time looks at history through the lens of dialectical progression of different phases. Let's not forget that for Marx, communism is capitalism gaining its own self-consciousness and not something beyond or outside it. And this finally brings us to Davor Löffler, a German philosopher, sociologist, and cognitive archaeologist. He too, in a similar way to Marx, embraces the view of history as phases of progression, or in his account, phases of integration, the image that you can see behind me. But the novelty of this approach comes from the understanding of technology as indirect expansion of the problem-solution distance, i.e. how many indirect steps does it take to make, for example, Egyptian pyramids or CERN Large Hadron Collider. And this is the framing within which the process of integration from one phase to the other progresses and functions, or is formalized. Similarly to what we've mentioned at the start of this talk, this progression happens outside of the concept or even of cosmologies, outside the discursive realm, although it is in many ways connected to them. Although cosmologies can certainly make certain events more probable or possible, i.e. makes us aware that the color of green is just as likely as green or blue, and thus work in tandem or come too early or too late. Everything is about accessing pockets of computational reducibility, a la Wolfram, and is the reason why post-capitalist thought is still in need, albeit in a different version today. The question of optimization of what can be accessed from the existing framework is the crucial one, and is the space where the critique of capitalism can be most persuasively made. So how does this connect to Löffler? For him, as we've already said, technology is simply the problem-solution distance expansion, i.e. how many steps does it take to produce an action in the environment and reveal new platonic processual forms. To put it crudely, throwing a rock takes only one step, while producing a large hadron collider and making contact with the electron needs thousands or even millions of them. Here we see the path that Löffler is taking and how this approach connects to the three other important concepts, i.e. expansion, recursion, and integration of civilizational capacity. For Löffler, history follows different stages whose previous ones are necessarily embedded within the newest configuration or phase of integration. To put an easy example to understand, the mechanism of a spear is embedded in the mechanism of a bow and arrow, and it's the concept of process emulative recursion that is of vital importance here. Löffler outlines three phases of integration, or caesuras, in civilizational history until now, and it turns out that we found ourselves in the middle of the transition from one civilizational stage, i.e. modernity, to the other, i.e. technological civilization. As Federico Campagna describes our moment in history, quote, "We have found ourselves in the position of being the past of a post-future." The thing is that through Löffler's method of deep futurology, we can extract actual historical patterns that enable us to not only speculate on the post-human, but deduce actual historical patterns of the matrix of the universe. Or in Löffler's own words, quote, "If this is true, then there is a matrix of possible worlds. Then it means that we can find the structure of why these worlds are emerging, and then we can ask, for example, what comes after the human, you see? And now we don't have to speculate on the post-human anymore. Now we can scientifically ground it. By logic and science, we can derive what could come after the human," end quote. Löffler outlines additional examples of how this process of ever greater complexity and hierarchical integration of the preceding layers will take place in the essay Distributing Potentiality, Post-Capitalist Economies and Degenerative Time Regime. In relation to the function of money, he, for instance, writes, quote, "The coin restabilizes the domestication of space in horizontal time. Recursively built upon the coin, capital restabilizes the domestication of space in vertical time. After capital, which contains the function of the coin as an abstraction in itself, a new medium will now emerge that contains the function of capital as an abstraction. In this world of process, exchange does not revolve around consumable objects, but around points of access to potentialities. The economic medium will couple process of becoming in fractal genetic time." The question of meta-cosmologies comes into play again. As we can see with Löffler and his radically materialist approach, cosmologies are not much more than orders of problem-solution distances and frameworks for revealing platonic processual forms, and have a fully materialist basis. Because of it, the register of action and conceptualization changes quite drastically and follows a different kind of meaning-making and the systemic critique in question. Similarly to the thermodynamic conception of what intelligence is, we can encounter a desubstantialized way of thinking without any prior or correct normative orientation around which we should position ourselves. No, the line of critique follows a different pattern, the one from the real, where the idea is to challenge in the greatest possible sense, the idea is to channel in the greatest possible sense the potentialities for further action and generation for the advancement of the orders of problem solution distances and the upgrading of our existing cognigrams, which are, as we've already seen, nothing else than the product of the current stage of civilizational capacity and are fully material and therefore in line for critique. Beyond meaning and our existing values, there's another realm that is animating us, and similarly to the Nietzschean axiological appeal to go beyond truth and morality, we are faced with a keen dilemma, with the challenge of advancing our understanding of ourselves with a different ethics, potentially connected to the ethics of being an object that Benjamin Bratton suggested, and that will look beyond normal constraints and existing institutional systems of meaning-making for the solution to our existing problems, to living at the end, at the break where history splits in two. This is also the reason why it's futile and miserable to mostly or always try to solve problems at an existing level, since the level in question is the problem. What makes new cosmologies meta is the fact that they are not about us and are therefore not quite invented, even if they have to be brought into being. That being said, different civilizations and cultures at different times are differently prepared for the new challenges ahead, for the advancement from one layer of integration to the other. As things currently stand, it seems to me that China, or in general Asiatic societies, are far better equipped to tackle the new challenges of humanity becoming a technological society. Not only are they collectivist and not uncompromisingly faithful to the dying individualistic framework, they are also post-capitalist in new ways. They already, albeit minimally, treat capital as potential, as an access to the fractal realm, and not solely as the abstract accumulation of wealth without any underlying understanding of what's actually being accumulated. And of course, it's no surprise that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't shy away from Marx and is also not embroiled in the meaningless culture war that we are seeing in the West. It radically circumvents such questions and looks at things through the demystified lens. It understands the question of mechanism design and what has been done and what has to be done in order for the different implementations to take place, and that the current incentive structures don't gain total control over society. Because if this happens, the players in the game can stop playing the game and have to mindlessly optimize ad infinitum. They have to obey Moloch, the demon behind every cooperation. And in this sense, the supposed alienness of capital is nothing more than the inability of capital to gain its own self-conscious role of what it really is, i.e. the distribution of potential, gas in the Ethereum sense. So maybe I can just show you all of the slides now for the end, so you can see how nice these Löffler's diagrams really are. Yeah, this is the problem solution distance. This is how life externalizes itself through this process, recursive recursion into the environment. This is the degree of indirectness. This is what, for Löffler, process of civilization is: continuous isolation of events and regularities, becoming of reality revealing regular processes. This is his, or from another German sociologist, framework of how human history until this point can be understood. And this is the diagram that I was referring constantly through my talk, and what German accelerationism in comparison to the British one really stands for, and in what way it's radically less speculative. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. That was quite astounding.